Okay, so we talked about how coral reproduce. Okay, we're going to talk today about how they get their food, so how they actually obtain the energy that they need to survive and to grow and build these big giant reefs. And then we're going to talk about locations on the reef, how reefs actually form, and then locations on the reef, and then the types of reefs. Okay, and then that's what we're looking at doing today. So coral get their nutrition from algae that live inside of their bodies. Okay, so remember we talked about how corals need to be in nutrient-poor water, and it kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because you're like, hey, these animals, they need nutrients, they need to grow. Why do they need to be in nutrient-poor water? Well, they need to be in nutrient-poor water because of the zooxanthellae, which is the algae that lives inside of them. So they actually have a mutualistic relationship with this algae, and they're little single-celled algae that live inside of their bodies. And those little algae, the zooxanthellae, do photosynthesis, right? Because they're plants. So they do photosynthesis, and they give the coral oxygen and glucose. Okay, so oxygen for respiration and glucose for getting energy, right? And then, so the corals will take that oxygen and glucose, and they will do cellular respiration and pass to the zooxanthellae the carbon dioxide and all of the nutrients and stuff that they need for photosynthesis. So it's a mutualistic relationship. So corals get, depending on who you ask, you'll hear anywhere between 90 and 98% of their food from these zooxanthellae, okay, from these algae that live inside of them. Okay, so they are symbiotic algae that live inside of them and give them most of their food. These zooxanthellae are found only in shallow water reef building corals. Okay, you do get deep sea corals that will form, but because they're deep sea, they actually don't have the zooxanthellae that live inside of them because they don't need it, because they live away from the sun. So the zooxanthellae wouldn't help them anyways because they can't do photosynthesis. So these pictures are to kind of help you see, kind of visualize what this looks like. So you get, if you look at like your brain coral, okay, if you take a little piece of the brain coral and you zoom in, you'll see the little polyps on there. If you take the little polyps and you look at those under the microscope, see all these like dots? Okay, those are the little single-celled algae living inside of the coral. Okay. A couple more pictures just to help you see. So see the brown spots on this? Okay, that's where the zooxanthellae are. Okay. So coral gets sugar and oxygen, and the zooxanthellae get carbon dioxide and fertilizer. So why does this explain why corals need to be found in nutrient-poor water? Well, remember, what are the two things that phytoplankton need to bloom? Light and nutrients. Okay, so they're in the tropics, so there's lots of light. If there were lots of nutrients, okay, in the tropics, you would get a big old phytoplankton bloom. Okay, well, phytoplankton, when they bloom, they make the water more murky. Okay, so they actually cut off sunlight from things that are down deeper in the water. Okay, and since corals need to be attached to a hard surface, they're attached down here at the bottom. If you get a phytoplankton bloom up here, those phytoplankton absorb all the sunlight, and now all of a sudden the corals that are down deeper in the water, they're not getting sunlight. And the zooxanthellae that are living inside of them that need that sunlight to do photosynthesis to feed the coral don't get sunlight, they can't do photosynthesis, and the coral doesn't get food, and now the coral is in trouble and can die. Okay? So they need that nutrient-poor water in order to prevent phytoplankton blooms so they can get sunlight for their zooxanthellae. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's why they need to live in nutrient-poor water. Picture of coral. Okay. So that's how zooxanthellae are the way that coral get most of their energy. Okay, but zooxanthellae can't do photosynthesis at night. Okay, and they are going to, corals are cnidarian, so they are going to be able to have stinging cells and get food in other ways, like being a predator. Right, so at night you'll actually see the corals unfurl like their tentacles and stuff, they stick their tentacles out into the water and they feed on little tiny animals that are in the water, like zooplankton. Okay, so they're going to eat a bunch of different zooplankton in the water, and that's how they get more of their energy. So they'll be predators. They also, here's a picture so you can kind of see what the coral looks like when all of its little polyps are sticking out. It kind of looks fuzzy, right? Because all the polyps are unfurled. Okay. They can also get nutrition from bacteria. So they actually have bacteria that live in them, kind of more of like a commensal relationship. The bacteria kind of, get a place to live and nutrients and stuff. And the coral doesn't really care that they're there unless the coral gets desperate for food. And then the coral can absorb and eat some of those bacteria. Okay. They also have these things called mesenteric filaments. So those are actually like these kind of like coiled tubes inside of their gut, in their gastrovascular cavity, and they can actually extrude those out of their mouth and like digest things outside of their body. And it'll actually be used as part of their defense mechanism, because if two corals get too close, they can actually fight. And one coral will stick the mesenteric filaments out of its mouth and like digest the coral that's next to it, okay, or at least part of it. Okay, so they do fight, and that's one way that they can get their nutrition. So that's how coral gets its nutrition. Right? Bacteria, mesenteric filaments, it's zooxanthellae, and then also filter feeding, or suspension feeding, technically. So suspension feeding. Okay, so that's how coral gets its food. Let's look at how reefs actually get built. Okay, and then we'll look at locations on the reef, and then types of reefs. So a reef is a huge structure. And the Great Barrier Reef is hundreds of miles long. It's several feet high, many feet high. So it's a huge structure. But the living part of the reef is actually only on the very, very surface. Okay? So the rest of that big old structure is actually dead. It's the remnants of dead coral, the skeletons of dead coral, and also like algae and shells of other things. Okay? So only the very, very surface of the reef is growing. So if you look at this, okay, the picture on the left is to show you that like this is all the dead part, and then the living part would just be right here at the very surface. And then if you kind of like blew up a piece of coral and looked at it really closely, this is what you would see. So the green and the red is the living tissue on the surface, and then all the white stuff, that's the skeleton. Okay, so that's the only part that's alive. This is all skeleton. And the skeleton's what I passed around to you so you can see. Okay? So the living part's just on the very surface. So how do these like little tiny animals that only live on the very surface form this big gigantic reef? Well, there's two phases to reef formation. You have a constructive phase and a destructive phase. Okay, a constructive phase is going to be where the little coral larva settles down and then starts growing into the new coral colony. Okay, so that's going to be the constructive phase. The destructive phase is called bioerosion. Okay, another term for it is bioerosion. Here's what happens. So you get this lovely coral that grows up, becomes a nice coral colony. Okay, and so this is going to be my coral colony. Okay, so it's growing, it's nice. And you get all sorts of like boring organisms. Not like boring like, oh, I'm so bored, but like they burrow into things. Okay, so you get like boring sponges and clams and worms and stuff that will actually burrow into the base of coral colonies. Okay, so they burrow down into the base of the colonies, and when they do that, they create like little holes here. Okay, and those little holes weaken the base of the coral. So now when you get a storm that comes, that coral colony is weakened and it falls over. Okay, so it falls over. And boring organisms continue to work on this, and just natural erosion of like pounding of waves will break this down even further, break it into smaller pieces. Now remember how we talked about there's 4 things that help to build the reef? The coral's the main one, but then you've got coralline algae, calcareous green algae, and then shells of animals. Yeah? Okay, so as this breaks down, okay, there's still going to be like cracks and stuff like that. You're going to get like calcareous green algae and then also shells of stuff that are going to come and like help to fill in the gaps. Okay, so those are going to come and kind of like help to fill in the gaps. And then you get coralline algae, the red algae, that grows over the surface of it. Okay, and that coralline algae is going to kind of take all of this like now sand and shells and pieces of coral, grow over the top of it and cement it all together. Okay, so it's going to cement it all together. Now you have a new hard surface for another little coral larva to come and settle down and start growing into a new colony. Okay, and then the boring organisms. Okay, and so you start to get layers and layers and layers and layers that form on top of each other as corals die, get broken down, and then cemented together and built on top of. Okay, so that's the constructive, destructive phase of reef formation. So with those two phases, that's how you can get these big, gigantic structures of reefs. Kind of cool, huh? And how these little tiny animals can actually make those. So let me show you some pictures to help you see this. Okay, so here's our coral colony with the little animals burrowing into the base. Okay, and then storm comes and knocks it down. Okay, and so here's like your coral continuing to get broken down, and then you get like shells and stuff like that, and other algae, the green algae, coming in to help to fill in the spaces. Okay, here's your shells. Okay, and then the coralline algae growing over the surface, new hard surface for little larvae to settle down and start growing again. All right? Okay, that's what it looks like. So the other most important reef builder besides the coral is your coralline algae. This is the coralline algae. It is the glue that holds that reef together. So it holds all of that sediment and broken pieces of coral all together. So how fast a reef can grow will be dependent on how fast the coral can grow. And how fast the coral can grow is dependent on how fast it can lay down its skeleton of calcium carbonate, limestone pretty much. So there are several things that affect how fast a coral can grow. And these are those things. So obviously, hopefully obviously, light is a big one, okay, because coral have their zooxanthellae, and their zooxanthellae provide most of the energy. So if the coral has enough light, zooxanthellae can do photosynthesis fast enough to provide enough energy for the coral to grow quickly. Okay, so the amount of light that the coral gets is a factor that influences how fast that coral grows. Because these corals do need light, that's why you only find them like on the continental shelf, okay, or around islands, because the islands create like a shallow place in the open ocean. So it allows for them to be attached to a surface and still be exposed to the sunlight. The species of the coral is also going to affect how fast the coral grows. So massive corals, those are like the big brain corals, the big round ones. Those grow much more slowly than like the branching corals, which would be like these. Okay, those they grow. The branching corals don't need to deposit as much of a like giant skeleton, right, as the massive corals do. So they can grow faster than the massive corals. Also, biological interactions are going to affect how fast that coral can grow. So there's always a huge competition for light and for space on the reef. Okay, so light because they need the light to do photosynthesis and to survive. Okay, and then space because they need a space to settle down and attach to, right, and then start growing. And then if they're growing next to another coral, and like they can be competing for light, right? So these are my toys. Okay, we're gonna play with these to explain this. So like if this coral starts to grow over this one, okay, this coral gets upset. It's like, hey, get out of my light, right? And so he's like, all right, then I'm gonna attack you, okay, and get you out of my way. And so this guy is going to extrude his mesenteric filaments and start digesting some of the coral polyps that are right here on the edge, okay? And so this guy can attack back, and they can go back and forth. So if they are living in a place where they are like in a lot of competition for space and for light, and they're constantly like having these battles. That will take a lot of energy away from the coral being able to grow because they're going to have to put a lot of energy into repairing the damage that's been done. Okay, so if they live in a place where there's lots of like fighting going on, then they're going to have to put more energy into defense and to repair than growing. So that's why that'll affect the growth rate. Wave strength is also going to affect how fast a coral can grow. So if a coral is in an area on the reef where you get a lot of waves that break right there, they're going to need to have a stronger skeleton to survive, okay, and not just get broken to pieces. So the coral is going to be putting more energy into strengthening and like bulking up its skeleton rather than putting it into new growth. Okay, so the wave exposure is going to affect the animal. All right, if they live in a place where there's not a lot of wave exposure, they don't need a big bulky skeleton, so they can put more energy into just like branching and growing and being all lacy and pretty. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, temperature will also affect them. I think you need to make a space for this in your notes. Okay, temperature. So they need to be between 68 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, depending on the species of coral. And if they get outside of that temperature range, typically what happens is they get too hot. Then they can undergo this process called bleaching. Okay, and what happens is when they get too warm, okay, corals actually will expel their zooxanthellae, right? Meaning like they kick them out. And it's called bleaching because corals actually get their color from the zooxanthellae that live inside their tissues. So the coral animals, most of them, many of them are clear, and the skeleton is white. So the only reason why you don't just see like the white skeleton underneath is because of the zooxanthellae that live inside the coral. So when those corals kick out those zooxanthellae, clear animal, white skeleton, what's left, it looks white. Okay? And so we call it bleaching because it literally looks like you took the coral and dipped it in bleach and got rid of all the color. Okay? And we don't really exactly know why they do this because to us it doesn't seem to make sense, right? It's like, okay, so you're under stress because you're too warm, so you kick out your main source of food. Yeah, that makes sense. Don't really know why they do it. We theorize that maybe it's to like try and uptake a different kind of zooxanthellae that's more tolerant of the temperature. Maybe, but that doesn't seem to ever work. So yeah, we don't really exactly know why they do it. You have a question? Let me show you the different types of coral, and then we'll look at what bleaching looks like. So these are the different types of coral shapes. So you have plate corals, foliaceous, columnar, branching. Here's your massive corals. Okay, there's your free living. That's like the little mushroom guy. Okay, and then encrusting grows over the surfaces of things. Okay, so those are the different types of corals. And these will all have different growth rates. So like the massive coral, the big brain coral will grow more slowly than the branching coral. Okay. Here's pictures of actual coral, so you can see them. So the massive coral, branching coral, foliaceous, columnar. Okay, here's the encrusting coral. This is the plate coral, and then this is the free living. That's that one, just alive with its tentacles sticking out. Okay, so you can see it. Kind of cool, huh? So those are the different kinds of coral. Bleaching. So this is when the corals expel their zooxanthellae. Okay, and here's what happens. So in a healthy coral, you have your skeleton underneath, and then this part right here, that represents the this represents like the coral animal. Okay, and notice the green dots inside of there. That's the zooxanthellae. So in healthy coral, you got the coral with the zooxanthellae inside. It's colored. Okay, it's pretty. It's all nice and green, at least for this picture. Okay, in bleaching, okay, the coral kicks out the zooxanthellae, right? So all the dots are outside here now, see? And so here's the coral animal. No zooxanthellae inside, see through to the white skeleton. It looks bleached. So here's an actual picture of it. It's actual coral. So you can see it literally looks like you took and dipped it in bleach. All right. They can reuptake their zooxanthellae if the water temperature goes back down, but not always. Okay. Locations on the reef. So I'm going to let you copy this down, and then I'm going to switch to the next slide, and I'm going to show you them while we talk about them, because then it'll make much more sense. So here's the locations on the reef. So the fore reef is this front slope right here that faces out towards the open ocean. Okay. So if you were like swimming this way, right, and you'd have the reef on this side, and then if you look to your left, you would just see like blue, open ocean. Okay. So faces out towards the open ocean. The reef crest is up here at the top. Okay, and that is similar to like the shelf break. So remember when we talked about the continental shelf, shelf break, slope, rise. Okay, the crest is similar to the shelf break because it's the transition between like the flat and then the slope, or fore reef slope. Okay, so it's the transition, and it tends to be the highest point on the reef. It's also where most of the waves break. Okay, so it withstands most of like the pounding of the waves. So that's the reef crest. And then behind that you have the flat, okay? So that's exactly what it sounds like. It's like a flat part on the reef. And oftentimes it's intertidal. So if it's high enough, okay, during low tides, it can be exposed to the air. Back reef, okay, is back here. This has very low wave energy. You're going to find a high diversity of corals and animals that live here. And then you've got the lagoon, okay, that separates the land from the reef. Okay, and in the lagoon you can have all sorts of things like seagrass beds. You also have like patch reefs that can form in here with like other little pieces of coral starting to grow. So lots of different things can be found in there. So this part around here, so this black part, okay, that actually represents and is there to show you the same species of coral and how it has to change its skeleton depending on the location it is on the reef, okay, which is due to the amount of wave action that that coral sees. Okay, so if you look right here at the reef crest, okay, the reef crest is where most of the waves break. Look at the skeleton of the coral here, okay, and even on the upper reef slope, okay. So notice that that coral has like it's bulked up, right? Its skeleton is like super big and strong and hefty duty, okay. So and then as you go down on the fore reef slope, okay, you get less wave energy as you go deeper, and so this coral is a little bit more lacy, delicate looking, okay, because it doesn't need that bigger, stronger skeleton. And then you can see like on the back reef and then like in the lagoon, okay, how there's less and less wave energy, and so it gets more and more delicate looking because it doesn't need to be big and bulky to survive. Yeah? Okay. On the fore reef slope, you also have like different kind of like zones or like areas where different kinds of coral will grow. Up at the top, okay, like near the reef crest, you'll actually get like the encrusting corals, the corals that grow over things, mostly because they can withstand more of the pounding, okay, from the waves. And so you find a lot of encrusting corals at the top. Below that, you find branching corals, okay, and you may think like that seems weird because branching corals are more delicate than like massive corals, so why are they found higher on the reef? Well, they're found higher on the reef because they need more sunlight because they grow more quickly. So they need to be up here. So they're found higher. And then below that, you find massive corals because massive corals don't need as much sunlight because they grow more slowly. And then below that, you have foliaceous and plate-like corals because they can spread out and capture lots of sunlight over a big area. Okay? So as you go down, you get different kinds of coral deeper and deeper on the reef. All right? Okay. Kinds of reefs. We have 3 kinds of reefs. Okay, you have a fringing reef, you have a barrier reef, and you have an atoll. So an atoll is this ring-like reef right here that you see in the upper right. Okay, barrier reef bottom right, and then fringing reef right here on the left. Okay, so let's look at those and talk about those. So fringing reef. A fringing reef is located right off the edge of the land. So it directly borders the land. It actually doesn't have a lagoon or a back reef. This is like in Hawaii. When you walk out into the water, you walk directly onto the reef flat. Okay, there is no back reef, no lagoon, because it's directly up against the land. So you walk out directly onto the reef flat. Here's kind of a picture. All right. So directly borders the land. This type of reef is probably going to be the most vulnerable to damage by humans, right? Because they're right up against the land, so we can walk right out onto it. And because it's right up against land, pollution, all sorts of runoff, stuff like that would also affect it the most, right? Because it's right there. So that's a fringing reef. The youngest type of reef, keep that in mind. I'll explain that at the end. Here. So here's another picture just to help you see it. All right. So here's the beach that you would lay on, right, in Hawaii. And then you can walk out onto the reef flat and then crest and fore reef slope. Okay? Okay. Second type of reef is a barrier reef. Okay? The barrier reef is separated from the land by a lagoon, and it has a back reef. It is also considered to be the second stage of reef formation. Again, I'll explain what that means. And then, example, obviously the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. The biggest one. Coolest one. So here's profile. So you can see lagoon, back reef slope, reef flat crest, fore reef slope. Okay, and then like I said, you could get patch reefs and stuff like that that'll pop up in the lagoon. So just another profile to help you see it. All right. Okay, on the fore reef slope, you'll actually get these things called spur and groove formations, where you get like basically jets of coral that grow, like these big long lines of coral that grow, and then next to that you'll get like channels of sand, and then like jets of coral, and then channels of sand, and then jets of coral and channels of sand. And that actually is really good for the reef. What it does is it actually allows, like, the channels of sand are exactly what they sound like. They're channels of sand that allow any of the sand that would get deposited on top of the reef to run down and go down to the bottom. Okay, because if it got deposited on the top, it'd smother the coral and the coral would die. So it allows for sand to get out of the way where it's not supposed to be. This is what it looks like from the air. Okay, it's called spur and groove formation. So you see like the dark line next to the lighter line, and the dark line, and the lighter line, dark line, lighter line. Yeah. So the dark lines are the coral, and then the lighter lines are the sand channels. Okay, and you can see the size of that compared to the boat that's right there, right? So it's a big reef. Okay, and then the last type of reef is an atoll. Okay, an atoll is a circular ring-shaped reef. The lagoon is located in the middle. So the lagoon's in the middle, and then you have the lagoon, the back reef, okay, that faces that lagoon. And then you've got like the reef flat all the way around, reef crest, and then the fore reef slope all the way around. Okay, the final stage of reef formation, and I will show you a picture and explain what that means. Okay. So basically, as you know, explorers were moving around, they were discovered these like ring-shaped reefs in the middle of the ocean. Okay, and they're like, this is weird because coral doesn't grow anywhere that's not shallow water because it needs sunlight. So how are we getting these circular shaped reefs? A, why are they circular? B, how are we getting them out in the open ocean where there's no shallow water? Here's what we discovered actually happens. So you get a volcano, right? Because of the plate tectonics and all sorts of like stuff that's going on below the surface, okay? And you get a volcano that forms. And that volcano erupts enough that it actually grows tall enough and becomes an island. Okay, that island sticks out of the water, and volcano stops. Okay, it's done. And so, but now you have an island. That island creates shallow water, right, and a place for coral larvae to start settling down and start forming a reef. Okay, the first type of reef that it will form is a fringing reef, right, just right off the edge of the land. Okay, so it starts as a fringing reef. Now that that volcano is dormant, okay, it's going to be subject to erosion, right? So from the waves and the wind, that volcano will start to erode. The reef stays in the same spot because that's where it started growing, but the volcano in the middle starts to erode, all right, and starts to shrink. When that happens, that fringing reef gets separated from the land and becomes a barrier reef, right? Because it's now separated from the land. If you keep going and that volcano continues to erode, the reef is left. The volcano is now below the surface of the water, and what you're left with is a ring-shaped reef in the middle of the ocean. Okay, and it's called an atoll. So that was an animation, and it's not working on my smart board. So I'm sorry. You can kind of see pictures right here on the right. Okay, so that's what happens. It's called an atoll. Okay, that's where we're stopping.